We have a friend of mine and of Steve Brewer's when the pandemic really began to grip the economy last year. Steve and I both knew there was one person to call, and that would be Jack Bobo. Steve and I knew that as a food futurist, he's someone who not only looks at the future of how food is prepared and processed, but policy, and of equal importance, and it's something that he discussed with me last night, consumer psychology. Think about this. One of the biggest takeaways from the pandemic that Jack pointed out to me and to Steve was the shift in the number of consumers who had never ordered groceries online prior to 2020. And now, of course, they will substantially order online going forward, as well go back to stores. Here to tell us more and to give us insights not about just trends, but about what matters is Jack Bobo, CEO of Futurity.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here. I'm always excited to come back to Iowa. I think I get here once or twice a year, with the sole exception of 2020. I'm talking to you a little bit about the role of innovation in transforming our food system, but really I want to talk to you about how to think differently about the future and about the things that you're encountering every day. Now, I spoke a few years ago at this event, and I ended that presentation by pointing out that the next 30 years were not just the most important 30 years there have ever been in the history of agriculture, but they're the most important 30 years there will ever be in the history of agriculture. Every day between now and 2050, it will get harder to feed the world. But every day after 2050, it will get easier because population growth slows dramatically. And so the challenge that we face is not to feed more and more people forever. It's that we have this window in which we need to succeed. If we get to 2050 without screwing up the planet, in many ways we're good forever. And so that's the challenge that we all face, and that's why innovation, of course, is so important. Now, as you know, science, though, tells us what we can do, but it's the public that tells us what we should do. And unfortunately, too often the public is telling farmers, agribusinesses, that they don't want the technologies that they need. And so that's a challenge that we face, is not just do we have the ability to solve these problems, but are we allowed to use the technologies to solve these problems? Now, I'll give you an example of how this is communicated by some organizations. The World Wildlife Fund has their Living Planet report that comes out every couple of years. And in the 2018 report, they pointed out that there's been a 60% decline in wildlife populations between 1970 and 2014. 20% of the Amazon has disappeared in the last 50 years. And that wild spaces will decline by a further 60% by 2050 if the current trends continue. So it's not a particularly good news story. But worse is that they say that agriculture is the single largest driver of all of these problems. Agriculture, they believe, is the problem to be solved. Now, when you ask people about the future, people tend to be very concerned and they think things are moving in the wrong direction. If you were to ask people this question, in the last 20 years, has the population, the proportion of people in the world in extreme poverty increased, decreased, or stayed about the same? When you ask this question, about 80% of people say things are bad and getting worse. 80% of people think things are bad and getting worse. Well, that leads people to believe that we have a broken food system. And when you look at some of the numbers, it's easy to understand why people might think that. About nearly 700 million people will go to bed tonight hungry. That's a lot of people. And it's obviously unacceptable that in a world that we have today that so many people would be going to bed hungry. That feels like a broken food system. But if you look at the numbers in a different way, Of course, the number of people that are undernourished has declined dramatically over the last 50 years. Less than 10% of all the people on the planet go to bed hungry every day, and that's obviously unacceptable. But 50 years ago, a third of all the people on the planet were going to bed hungry. The public's conception of the direction we're going isn't consistent with reality. If you look at the amount of land needed to produce a certain amount of crop, it's gone down dramatically. Farmers are producing so much more, using so much less. It's going in the right direction, but people don't know it. If we look at production, well, the reason that so many people have been lifted out of poverty is because production has grown so much faster than population. So as quickly as population has been growing, food production has been ahead of it. That's also a good news story that people don't understand or appreciate. How do we get people to understand that things are good and getting better, not bad and getting worse? Child mortality, dramatically lower. So by all of these measures, things are wildly better than they were. How do we get these organizations to recognize this? And this is important because without an understanding of how important agriculture and production is, they won't support the innovative tools that we need to do even better. So if you look at the amount of land that's being used to produce crops, yes, agricultural land has expanded and it has had an impact on rainforests and other things. But without innovation, we wouldn't have the green part of this chart, which is yield gains. And without that innovation, the 3.6 billion hectares of forest that remain, 1 billion of them would be gone. More than a quarter of all the forest on the planet exists today solely because of innovation. That's the story that we should be focused on, not the fact that agricultural land has expanded into some of these places, which we need to address, but you don't address it by undermining the tools, you address it by creating more tools. Now, part of the problem that we have is around this term sustainable, and there was some of the supporters here today understand the issue of sustainability well. But there is a problem in terms of how the public views sustainability and how most farmers view sustainability and how most businesses think of sustainability. So later this year, the UN is going to have a food system summit where they're going to talk about how do we create a more sustainable future. But they're focused on not just sustainability, but a certain type of sustainability. And that sustainability is in many ways following what Europe has been doing. And it's focused on local sustainability. And that's the real challenge that we have, is that for most people in the public, they think of sustainability in terms of local sustainability. If I use less water, less fertilizer, less insecticides, less pesticides, that must be better. But for most farmers and businesses, we think of global sustainability. The more intensively I produce my crops, the fewer hectares of forest need to be cut down. The more I produce, the more intensively. And so this local versus global sustainability is important. The reality, of course, is that sustainability is a continuum from local to global, and there will always be trade-offs. If you have less intensive agriculture, you need more land. More intensive, you have more runoff or other things. So this is important. Sustainability is not a destination, it is a journey. And we need to stop thinking of it as a place that we can all go. Now, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization indicates that we need between 50 or 60% more food by 2050. By some estimates, it's as much as 100% more protein. So that is a big challenge that we face. And the World Resources Institute creates a map of what it's going to take in order for us to get there, and they break it down to these different categories of improving productivity and other things. And so they're talking about this is the map of how we're going to get to that future. But we need to think differently about not just the future, but about the challenges we face. Because we're not going to solve tomorrow's problems with yesterday's thinking. And so I want to give you some examples of how to think differently. Now, if I were to ask people, let's say I have 2 cars at home, I have a truck and I have my VW, and I'm going to replace one of them. And I normally drive each of them about 10,000 miles a year. So my wife wants me to get a Prius, and I want to get a Hummer. And the Hummer's only going to get 20 miles per gallon, and the Prius is going to get 50 miles per gallon. So by a show of hands, how many people think that the Prius is the better environmental choice? Some people think, okay, so a fair number of people think if you care about the environment, you buy the Prius. Okay, well that's sort of linear thinking, and I had to bring out this chart to explain to my wife that the pro-environment person would be getting the Hummer. So let's look at it. If I were to buy that Hummer, I would go from 10 miles per gallon to 20. I would use 500 gallons less fuel that year, save 500 gallons. If instead I were to buy that Prius, I'd go from 20 to 50 miles and I'd only save 300 gallons. It is wildly better for the environment for me to buy the Hummer. But no, my wife says, what if we get a Tesla? And that gets the equivalent of 100 miles per gallon. Sorry, dear, that's only going to save us 400 gallons. So the point, though, is that it seems like a straightforward question of what is better for the environment, but sometimes you have to stop and do the math. And we often make important decisions about our future without stopping to do the math. We need to think differently about the future. We need to find ways of combining the trends that we see. A robot is a physical embodiment of artificial intelligence. So we think about, robotics, and people are worried that robots are going to start taking jobs. And that's a very linear way of thinking about the challenge that we face from robotics. In the farm world, 70% of people were involved in farming, less than 1% today. Robotics could reduce that. People worry about losing jobs, rightfully so. But we also forget that if you can reduce labor costs, then maybe we don't need to be bringing things from China anymore, because we produce things in China because labor is cheap and transportation isn't that important. But if labor costs go down, then all of a sudden transportation becomes the more important challenge. So maybe all of that manufacturing starts coming back because of robotics. So again, thinking about a problem that we're all familiar with and looking at it from a different perspective. I often hear that big food companies can't innovate. They're large, they're slow, they're risk averse, they're indecisive, all sorts of reasons why big food can't innovate. And some business schools like to use the example of Yoplait and how it got crushed by Chobani with the Greek yogurt. And they say that, Yoplait just didn't see it coming. They weren't very good at innovation. Maybe, but maybe consumers don't want innovation to come from big food companies. Maybe we're not thinking about it in the right way. So let me give you a different example. A year before Oatly took over the oat milk market, Quaker Oats came out with oat milk. And they put it in the grocery store, and nobody bought it. Because you have all of those people who love Oatly today, well, they're early adopters. And they went into the grocery store and they saw Quaker oat milk on the grocery store shelf, and they thought, could there be any more boring product than Quaker oat milk? A year later, they walked into the grocery store and they saw Oatly. And they thought, oh my God, this is amazing. They're so innovative, these startup companies. And so the problem is with something like Quaker oat milk is early adopters don't buy Quaker Oats. And the public that doesn't, most people, 85% of the public, they don't try new things. So they see Quaker Oats, and they're like, I'm not going to try oat milk. So what should have happened is that in January of 2020, the month that they killed the product, Quaker Oats, oat milk, is the month they should have introduced the product. And then all of a sudden, 85% of consumers who don't try new things, who have been hearing about Oatly for a year, would have thought, maybe I'll get Quaker Oats a try, because they trust the brand. So again, we often think about what's going on, that big food companies aren't trying, they're not innovating. But what's really happening is often something very different. And we need to understand not just the idea of innovation and coming up with new products, but how consumers think about new products. So I want to talk a little bit about the future and how to think about the future. And I like to use the example of the car because our windshield is like foresight. We can see what's in the road ahead of us. In our rearview mirror, that's hindsight. We know where we've come from. But how do you know what's around the corner? That's where you need the GPS. You need to be able to think about what are we going to do, what's coming around the corner. And that's what futurism is about, is helping to look around corners. So why should we think about the future when we don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow? So most of us are so focused on the here and now that we can't look that far out. The problem is that the present is messy, it's noisy, and it's already happening. There's so little chance of influencing what's going to happen tomorrow. We actually have a great opportunity to influence what's going to happen a year from now, 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. So we actually have a greater opportunity to influence the future. So instead of thinking about now, next, future, we want to think about now, future, next. Because that will help us to figure out what to do next. And I'll talk about forces and signals and trends and what do those mean. So most people are focused on the trends. If you go online, of course, this is the month where everybody's coming out with their top 10 trends of 2021. Last year at this time, I opened up one of those reports and it said, we're so excited, the top 10 trends of 2020, not a single one of them was on the list in 2019. And I'm thinking, well, if they weren't on the list, then they're not really trends, they were fads. And if you're a business and you're looking at that list thinking, what should I be producing? You go through 12 to 18 months to produce a product and it's not on the list anymore? That's not helpful. So we need to be thinking not about the trends, but about the forces that shape the trends, because that's how you get out in front of them. There are all sorts of trends that we could be talking about, but I'm not going to talk about them. We can talk about that over coffee later. I want to talk about forces. There are forces, whether it's the environment or health or other things, because those explain lots of trends, and that's how we get ahead of them. So if we were to look at the innovation landscape for plant-based milk, it looks something like this. And if we were to look at the innovation landscape for dairy, it looks a little like this. And there's this feeling that all of a sudden that these alternative milk companies are taking over and that people don't like dairy anymore. But if you don't offer people any choices, don't be surprised if over time they move on to try new things. So it's a lack of options, not just a lack of innovation. There are tons of patents that are filed every day in the dairy industry. Unfortunately, most of them are for manufacturing and things not related to what's happening with the consumer. So the forces that are shaping the trends in dairy, yes, it's about health, yes, it's about environment, but it's mostly about choice and variety. Dairy has failed to deliver choices to people, and people just want to try new things. In 1980, you could go into a grocery store and buy Prego or Ragu tomato sauce, but today there are thousands of choices. Consumers like to have choice. And so consumers, we spend a lot of time and energy trying to market dairy to consumers, but 95% of homes already have dairy in the refrigerator. It's not an awareness issue, it's an options issue. So we need to think about the problem in a different way. Now, the science fiction writer William Gibson said, the future is already present here, it's just unevenly distributed. You can understand the future by looking around you. And we need to spend more time doing that. So how to think about the future? Well, we don't want to think about the future in terms of predicting it. That's not what a futurist should be doing or should tell you they're doing. It's really about possible futures. And it's about plausible futures. And it's about the probable future. So when we think about the future, you don't want to just think, what do I think will happen? But you want to think, what could happen? How do we get out of our bubble of thinking into just things that are wildly possible? The most interesting ideas about the future are the craziest ones. If somebody tells you about the future and it seems highly probable, that's not very interesting. You probably didn't learn anything. You want the craziest ideas. So what we're really looking for when we talk about the future is not just what are the possible futures, the plausible and the probable, but of all of those futures, which one is best for you? What is your preferred future? And that's why it's important to start with the future and then bring it back to the present. Because it's not just what's the future going to happen to you, how can you happen to the future? How can you create the future that you want? I'm going to talk a little about that as well. Now, we often think of these competing protein trends as a threat. And if you read reports like the Rethink X, it talks about the disappearance of the livestock and dairy industry within a decade. And that's not going to happen. So that's not realistic. That's an organization that is predicting a future that they want to happen, but it's not based on what's really happening. Yes, there are plant-based proteins that are out there. There's cell-based protein. There's fermentation. So there is an entire landscape that's happening. And for many, that creates concern that there's not an opportunity. But really, these are complementary trends. They're not competing trends. Because remember, we need 50% more protein by 2050. We've got $1 trillion industry today. There's another $500 billion on the table that's coming. If those alternatives were to capture all of it, nobody would lose a single head of cattle, a single cow. Of course, they're not going to capture it all, so that's not really a concern. The question is, how do we create a future where we meet that growing demand in a more sustainable and nutritious way? And that's going to be by using all of these tools. It's not going to be one or the other. So we need to figure out how to create that preferred future. And it starts with a clarity of vision. If you don't know where you're going, it's really hard to get there. And too often, we're thinking about what we're going to do tomorrow, and then the next day and the day after that. Well, 10 years from now, you'll just be somewhere, but you won't really know how you've gotten there. We need that clarity. And with that clarity, we can begin to figure out what we should be doing next. Now, the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard said, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. But by thinking in terms of what the future could be, we can begin to figure out where we want to go and how we're going to get there. So I want to return to this chart. Now, the World Resources Institute, they're focused on all of those different things that are necessary to get to that sustainable future. They're not focused on that green bar at all. But the green bar is the most important bar. That green bar contains 61% of all the improvements that need to happen by 2050. That's business as usual. That's farmers doing what farmers do every day. Gets us 2/3 of where we need to be to have a sustainable future. And yet they're focused on the things that aren't being done as opposed to how much is being done. Farmers are not the problem to be solved. Farmers are the solution to the problem. They need to be focused on how to help farmers, and I've circled the green and the blue bars there relate to productivity and efficiency, to do better than they are. And so we need to find ways of bringing people together. There's too much division right now, and it's undermining consumer confidence in the food system, and it's making it harder for all of us to do what we need to do. I tell people that my personal mission is to de-escalate the tension in our food system so that we can all get about our business of saving the planet in our own way. If somebody has a different idea about how to get there, that's great. But if you're doing what you can every day in order to make a more sustainable and nutritious future, that's good enough. We need to focus on what we're doing. So one thought I want to leave you with is that the future rewards clarity and it punishes certainty. What does that mean? Well, when we have a vision, we know where we're going, and we need that. But certainty, well, that's what that Rethink X report is. It's telling you how you're going to get to that future, and we don't know how we're going to get to that sustainable and nutritious future. Maybe it will be because livestock improves. Maybe it will be because fermentation provides some benefits. Maybe it will be because cell-based scales. We don't know. But we know that we want to get to a sustainable and nutritious future. So as you go about your day, you should seek out those voices of clarity. And I think you're going to hear from some later today. You heard from some this morning. You want to avoid those voices of certainty. People who are telling you, this is how we get there. Nobody knows how we get there. It's good enough to know where you want to go. And we need to be flexible. So returning to that analogy of the car, people that are certain, that's like when you write down the directions and you say you want to go down this highway and then take a right at the farmhouse and then take a left at the oak tree, and somebody draws you that map. And then you go, and it turns out there's a detour. And all you knew where you wanted to go, but you don't know what to do when you run into the detour, a blocked road. You need to be flexible in order to find out how to get there. And that's what, again, the GPS helps us define those alternative routes. Because it's not going to be as easy, it's not going to be as straightforward as we imagine, but those who are flexible in how they think about it will deal with it. Organizations and companies that have a fixed plan, they break in the face of uncertainty. And there are a lot of parts of the food system that did break over the last year, but for the most part, the food system was highly flexible. And it bent, and it adapted, and we were all better for it. So for the rest of the day, I just encourage you to think about what is your preferred future and who are the people that you can connect to help create that preferred future, and one that we can all get behind, because by and large, most people want that sustainable and nutritious future. We're not working against each other, we're working with each other. And so I look forward to a few questions. Thank you.
I really liked your point about choosing your future. You know, that's extremely proactive, and it has to be done. You're talking about a combination of individuals and industries, okay? And that, to me, the stress lately has been on the individual, but the focus has been against industries. Would you elaborate on that a little, please?
Well, you see this in Europe with their farm-to-fork strategy. You know, they have told people, this is how you get to the future that we want. It's going to be 25% organic. It's going to be reduced by 50% fertilizer and all these things. And that's going to create an impact, because if 25% of the land in Europe were organic, they would produce 8% less food. Well, what country sends the most food to Europe? Brazil. So Europe's going to export its environmental footprint to the most biodiverse country on the planet. Might not be a good idea. On the other hand, if they said, our goal is to have 25% of our land be organic while producing just as much food, well, that means innovation is important, right? So we want to reduce by 50% the amount of fertilizer while producing just as much food. By opening the door to the innovation, what seemed like a challenge becomes an opportunity. And so how we frame those conversations, and unfortunately, too often right now, in places like Europe, they're closing the door to innovation while also demanding more of farmers. And that's probably not going to end well.
Been a lot of studies, and I don't mean to focus exclusively on Europe, but there have been a lot of studies recently about the European Union and the subsidies and the issues they've been having from an agricultural standpoint that have just been completely skewing the entire process. So on the one hand, you have the window dressing about what we'd like to achieve and the ways we'd like to do it and how we'd like to increase or decrease certain metrics. And on the other hand, they have some enormous issues as far as their subsidies and how they're being distributed towards certain political elites.
Yeah. So I don't think there's anything to add to your point, is that it's not necessarily benefiting the average consumer in Europe. It's not necessarily benefiting the average farmer in Europe. They're just making it more complicated, more challenging to achieve the goals they have.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us. We do have a question.
So it's a great message that you have, but how do you get the rest of the world to buy into that message and get it out there?
Right. Well, one way of doing it is for the U.S. government to participate more in the UN Food System Summit and to ensure that there is a seat at the table for innovation. And the current administration, and I'm sure the next administration, are going to do that. But the other thing I would say is that when it comes to working with organizations like these conservation groups, there are groups like the World Resources Institute that do recognize the role of innovation, and that there are partnerships that can be made to bring some of these people together, because it's not going to be the voice of farming or the voice of agribusiness that's going to change the mind of the consumer. It's going to be working with the Nature Conservancy and others to show them how you're helping to achieve their goal. And so I think that there are organizations that can be partnered with in order to do that. And that's the only way the consumer is going to understand that some of the things they're asking for today are not going to deliver what they want. You know, I'm a fan of organic and regenerative and other things, but that alone isn't going to solve the problems that we have. It's part of a solution, but it's not the solution.
Have you taken a closer look at Leading Harvest, which was presented earlier?
I haven't, but I will.
Very good. I'd like you
Yeah.
to do that. I've got some materials. We did an in-depth look at it this time last year, and the idea from a sustainability standpoint, you know, you're looking at very large farmland owners who obviously are charged with getting a return, and yet they're looking at sustainability efforts, and they're doing it, they're self-regulating basically.
Right.
And they're doing it in a way that I hope, and we will continue to support it at the Land Report, will increase and generate greater appreciation for these efforts to make farmland more resilient, healthier, and more productive for its owners.
Yeah. I worry a little bit about conversations around sustainability as a metric, because that makes it feel like there's a destination we're trying to get to. And if you think of it as a journey, it's about, am I doing a better job than I did last year? That's easy. We all know whether or not we're doing that. But reducing water use, well, that's important if you're in Arizona, but doesn't matter much if you're on the Chesapeake and it's all rain-fed. So as a metric, it might not be important. Reducing nutrient runoff might matter if you're on the Mississippi, but it might not matter if you're in the middle of Iowa. So, you know, the same metric may mean different things to different farmers in different places.
Good. I'll be happy to introduce you to Kenny and the crew. Thank you very much, Jack.
Thank you.